Thank you, Mr. Holloway. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. One day there will be a public inquiry into the conduct of the government during this pandemic and the decisions it's taken, particularly around how it provides financing to different parts of the country. And we'll be able to learn from the last few months and on what went well and what didn't. And I hope that we'll all support such an inquiry so that in future further errors are not made. Even before the pandemic, it would have been hard to argue that national government was a friend of local government and local services. Since 2010, since the 2010 general election, the government has reduced funding for local authorities by some £15 billion. The National Audit Office found that government funding for local authorities has fallen by 49% in real terms from 2010-11 to 2017-18, and they also say that this is a 28.6% real terms reduction. Or to put it in context, councils have lost 60 pence out of every pound they had a decade ago. The IFS concurs and says local government spending has fallen significantly. Let us never forget that this is not by accident. It was a decision made by the Conservative ministers with their Liberal Democrat coalition partners in the 2010-15 government, and national government grants were gradually scaled back so that poorer areas with great need were not provided with the additional funding that they needed alongside local income generation. The cuts made in the name of austerity didn't fall on the shoulders of people equally and local authorities equally. It hurt the poorest and the most disadvantaged areas significantly, including areas like Tower Hamlets, where my constituency is. The IFS says that deprived communities, those communities most reliant on public services, such as ones, as I said, in my constituency, saw the greatest reduction in national government funding. There's another unfairness in the way in which funding was allocated, and particularly around government grants, and that has pretty much disappeared. It has made it very difficult for local authorities to deal with child poverty. Child poverty is one of the highest in my constituency and across the borough. The two constituencies in my borough, the Poplar and Limehouse constituency and Bethnal Green and Bow, unfortunately has the highest child poverty rate in the country. So it's vital that the allocation of funding is fair and addresses the actual needs of communities. According to the LGA, between March and June this year, councils have faced a bill of £4.8 billion because of extra costs and lower incomes due to the coronavirus pandemic. And they estimate that the increased pressures on adult social care alone will be £533 million, and on public health, £148 million. Future non-tax income losses due to COVID will be around £634 million. And so, in summary, in terms of funding, the coronavirus pandemic has added even greater challenges to already pressurised local authorities up and down the country. And of course, it's been the worst in poorer areas. And I know many other speakers will want to speak to their own experience of their own council's struggles in coping with all those challenges, providing the services that are much needed while dealing with the pandemic. And in addition, Mr. Chairman, the fact is local authorities have had to also rise up to the challenge of making up for the fact that the testing and tracing system has been inadequate, which is funded through providing a £12 billion fund to Serco and other private contractors. But actually local authorities have had to also step in to serve their communities to make that work. So they are taking on additional responsibilities because of the pandemic, but not getting the funding that is needed. The government promised to provide that funding, and it's falling short. And so I hope that while I welcome the funding that was provided, which was in the order of £3.2 billion of emergency funding, and also the CCG funding of some £300 million, it does still leave billions of pounds in terms of shortfalls, which is putting local authorities in a position between a rock and a hard place. And I think that this applies to councils that are Labour-run, Lib Dem-run, Conservative-run even, in terms of the struggles facing local authorities in balancing the books. And indeed, we know of cases where some of them have declared that they are going to go bankrupt or are declaring bankruptcy. And that's a big worry for communities when local authorities are in the front line of cleaning up streets, looking after those who are vulnerable, dealing with some of the issues around the pandemic and providing support, including even police, supporting the police service because of the cuts, 20,000 officers that were taken out of the system over the last decade. So in reality, what it means for communities like mine in Tower Hamlets is that we have faced £200 million of cuts over the last 10 years. The extra cost of COVID has been means that a further £30 million will have to be found, saved, or services would have to face some dramatic changes which will be damaging to people by 2024. And at the same time, the demand for services has grown. And we've also experienced the fourth highest age standardised death rates in the country at the height of COVID. And the health inequalities and the other factors that make people vulnerable means that our local authority has to work closely with resources, with other agencies to protect people. And their actions have literally saved lives. We would have seen even greater numbers of deaths if the local authorities working with other partners hadn't done what they did. But they can't do that with the continue to do what they've been able to do without the support from national government. So if we also look at education, for instance, schools are suffering and they need support, and local authorities have worked closely with them to provide that support, but they need the funding. They need funding for, as we saw over the summer, in terms of the debates around holiday hunger, child poverty. My local authority has stepped in a long time ago to help keep children fed. But the food bank queues are astonishing, and I would very much welcome the Minister visiting some of the food banks in my constituency. Just one food bank, Bow Food Bank, that I met with recently, along with others, but Bow Food Bank, is seeing a dramatic increase in the number of people. And these are not the usual suspects who've needed help because they are extremely vulnerable. It's also middle-income families who are struggling now because of COVID, because of the issues around their employment and the lack of support. So the need is greater, but the funding and resources are not there. And so in terms of other young people as well, those who are in the SEND category, young people with disabilities, young vulnerable children, the services available to them face threats, not just in my constituency, but up and down the country. And it cannot be right, Mr. Chairman, that those who are most vulnerable face the double whammy of the coronavirus pandemic, the long-term funding cuts, and now further damage to their future life chances. So we need the government to act and use the spending review announcements tomorrow to make sure that the local authorities get the support they need to protect our communities. And if people, I'm sure the Minister will say there are limited resources, of course, but the question is, how is that money being used? And we have to ask, is it right that the Towns Fund, for instance, as the NAO and others have pointed out, over £3 billion, is it right that kind of money is allocated in the way it has been done, rather than focusing on indicators of need? It cannot be right. That kind of favouritism is what breeds distrust and also smacks of pork barrel politics, and it is absolutely unacceptable. So how money is allocated and spent is crucial. And then, of course, there have been scandals around the PPE case and other scandals. So I think it's right that the government needs to refocus its resources in a way that it's fair and appropriate. Because what we've seen is that in many local authorities, not just mine, whether it's Sunderland, Knowsley, Sheffield, Gateshead, South Tyneside, Oldham, and many others who desperately need additional funding and not getting it. And I could go on, and I'm sure other members will, of the number of local authorities that need support and are not getting it. So what we need is the government to really think quickly and act quickly to ensure that local authorities get the support they need. If they don't, then what we face in the middle of a second wave, in the middle of a crisis that we've like no other, is that more lives will be put at risk, not only because of the pandemic, but also the secondary effects of extreme vulnerability and that not being addressed and supported through local action and the actions of local authorities because they don't have the capacity and resources to act. So I hope, Mr. Chairman, the Minister today will take on board the concerns, not just the ones that I've raised around children and young people, adult social care, and the wider issues about local government funding and the underfunding and neglect of local government, who are frankly at the front line delivering services, and they don't get the recognition and credit that they deserve for the work they do, and decent public servants who work very hard to deliver for our constituents, that we need to back them up, we need to support them, because if we are to fight and win this battle against the coronavirus pandemic, we're going to need them even more than ever before, and we're going to need also that collaborative effort between the private and the public sphere and public sector to deliver on the implementation of the vaccine as well as improving the testing and tracing on top of all that they do. So I hope that we can build some consensus here in this debate today across members in all parties today to make the case for local government, because they are absolutely at the heart of addressing the challenges we face in this pandemic, but also the long-term challenges of tackling inequality and genuinely fighting to level up. If this government genuinely means what it said in the election of levelling up, it needs to put its money literally where its mouth is and deliver. And I hope that the Minister will make that case later on today to the Chancellor ahead of his statement. Thank you.